Well, hello, everybody. This is a three-way. It's myself, Richard McColl for Colombia Calling, and we are the three of us, three independent media outlets together going to discuss media bias and take into account what is going on in the US at the moment and put it into context with that in Colombia. So on the line from Medellin, we have none other than the enfant terrible of Adriaan Alsema of Colombia Reports, and down the road in Chapinero in Bogota is Joshua Collins of Pirate Wire Services. So it's the three of us chatting today. This is like a dream team.
Yeah, sort of.
Sort of a dream team or a nightmare team. I don't know. It's a nightmare rather than a dream. But we're going to discuss all of these things. And Adriaan has put together a whole format. And in about, I guess, around 35 to 40 minutes, we're gonna get into some of the real nitty gritty of what has taken place from our perspectives, but taking firm examples and quotations and so on to prove our points. It's not just opinions being thrown out there. That's easy enough for anyone. We are coming here with hard facts. So jump on in. Adriaan, do you want to tell us what we're doing?
Well, I was watching TV this week, and I saw all these protests on American campuses, and I noticed that there was similarities in the reporting in corporate media, which was similar to what we saw in Colombia when there was the Paro Nacional, major protests in 2019 and 2021. So I figured we'd compare the two and see what's happening.
Mm-hmm. And Joshua, of course, you are a United States citizen. You are a New Yorker. You certainly have some opinions and some knowledge on what's going on there. I think I'm specifically pointing at the protest at Columbia University.
Yeah, so earlier this month, protests started at Columbia University, which is an Ivy League college in New York, and police initially cleared the encampment, but that rose to similar protests on other campuses in the U.S. And as of 3 or 4 hours ago, there are now protests in over 40 campuses, according to The Guardian. And in the last few days, some campuses and some local police have arrested or dismantled those camps in New York, Los Angeles, California, and Atlanta. But that doesn't seem to be slowing down these protests, even though the school year is ending. And even though in Texas, Abbott sent the state guard to the University of Texas in Austin to arrest almost 200 protesters, there seem to be more sympathetic protests springing up, despite the fact that graduation ceremonies are in about a week.
This sounds like reactionary capabilities there. It's sending was it that you said the state guard? Is that the National Guard?
Yeah, so every state has a unit of the National Guard that's at their disposal. Abbott ordered the National Guard to clear students from a public university.
Wow. I mean, I'm just thinking, I'm thinking of Kent State right now. I mean, that's what National Guard being sent in, Kent State and Vietnam War protesting.
Yeah, of course. And interestingly enough, Kent is one of the universities that is participating in these protests.
Well, it's got a history to fulfill.
Right.
And Adriaan, what about the protests in Colombia then? When we were looking at those, could we see things, similarities?
Well, yeah, because so far in the United States, 500 students have been arrested. There have also been like street protests, and this is quite similar in Colombia in 2019, when student protests were like growing increasingly big, particularly in Bogota, but also in Barranquilla and in Medellin. And at one point, the government decided to change the tax law and give like discounts to the rich, and this like created massive protests, which I believe in 2021 ended up like being like there were like 900,000 people on the street. And there were also more than at least like 1,600 arrests made by the police, on claims that there was like a massive violence. So what I wanted to do is have a look at like how the headlines that have come out in the United States, how they compare to those in Colombia at the time.
So, Joshua, do you know of any good headlines going on up there? Because it seems to me that these kind of headlines ignite further protests. I mean, really, you know, they spur on.
There have been some rather sensational headlines in US media calling protesters terrorists, or saying things like they're out of control, like they have a New York Post thing here that was they're wreaking chaos. But you know, I'd like to, before I get to that question, there's another similarity that I've noticed. I've done coverage on the street of a lot of protest movements in a lot of countries, and I find that state responses, there's always parallels between them, right? And we see this happening right now in the United States. So usually one of the first steps when a state is unhappy with protests that are occurring is that they will try to demonize the protesters. Before we get into the media, I'd like to point out some quotes here. I mean, we've got DeSantis calling these people anti-Semite Hamas supporters. We have Biden also on the record in a press conference yesterday saying that these protests are inherently anti-Semitic. We've had Nancy Pelosi suggest that they're funded by Russia. So, I mean, these are pretty boilerplate accusations that I hear a lot. Like when I was in Ecuador, everyone said that the protesters were being paid by Correa. Here in Colombia, they said the protesters were terrorists who were sympathizers for ELN and the FARC. So, I mean, these are kind of really standard responses of a state. Like the first step in addressing protests from the point of view of the state is to demonize the protest movement. Mm-hmm. And we already see politicians from both parties trying to do that in the United States. But getting into actual media bias, I mean, some of this is a matter of opinion. So if a headline personally makes you mad because you don't agree with something that's happening in it, I think that's a different issue than institutional bias. But I think that the most common problem for respectable media when they're trying to cover protests is that oftentimes, imagine that you're a journalist for Reuters. You've got 2 hours to file a story. It just broke. You got to get up there before everyone else beats you to the story. So what do? I mean, you don't go down to the protest movement and have a nice, long, nuanced conversation with protesters. You snatch a couple signs offline, you call the police, maybe you call the mayor's office. If you can, you get in touch with the administration at the college where the protest is happening. So what you end up with is this institutional approach that inherently ignores the voice of protests. I don't think this is a malicious like conspiracy as much as it's just a byproduct of the way the fast news cycle nowadays works. But I know you guys have some examples of some more specific instances of biases you wanted to discuss.
But that
well, I've gathered some headlines from both like US media on the current protests and on the Colombian protests in 2019 and 2021. So today on Fox News, I read anti-Semitism on campuses surges as agitators take over. On Monday in the New York Times, it said some Jewish students are targeted as protests continue at Colombia. And also on Monday, you talked about the terrorists. The Wall Street Journal started an article with Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and others are grooming activists in the US and across the West. Now, yeah, it is. But so if you compare that like with what came out in Colombia, RCN reported on May 3 of 2021 that the ELN and the FARC dissidents would have infiltrated marches. In 2019, that same television station reported the acts of violence that marred the marches in Bogota. And Semana also focused on violent incidents that were really minor during those marches. So like on November 29, 2019, Semana wrote, "Vandals, will there be justice?" And again on April 30, 2021, "Are the Vandals winning the game?" Which is kind of, well, it's particularly interesting how the terrorism claims are similar in the US. And if you in the terrorism claim in the US, like what's the source for this?
The source for claiming these people are terrorists?
Yeah.
I mean, I've seen no proof of anything like that.
Oh well, in Colombia, like the police was making those claims, and this was copied quite blindly by corporate media. Well, certain corporate media, not all.
I do think that that's very similar, and that's an important distinction. That oftentimes media are relying on official sources, and it's very well documented that the police will lie to reporters. That's like one of the most important lessons I've had in my years of being a journalist. Is I've had police just lie to my face. So I think it's really good not to just take their statements at face value. But I think that there is kind of a difference in the media landscape in that in Colombia, the people who own the largest and most important media communications, such as television and radio, I mean, print is not as much of a big deal here, but Semana to a lesser extent, those are all direct contributors to conservative political parties here. Now, we have some of that in the States, but there's at least a imaginary separation between editorial and the newsroom in theory, although that doesn't always work out in practice. We could talk for 2 hours about that. But what I'm trying to say is that in theory, the large, like the big media Colombia landscape is very sympathetic towards the ex-governments of Duque and Uribe, to a lesser extent Santos. Whereas in the US, you have large media conglomerates that could be perceived as sympathetic to either political party. And I think that's an important distinction.
I want to jump in on one thing that you said earlier, Joshua, about this, taking the quotes directly from, let's say, government officials or the police or so on. It's what's known now in the business as a protest paradigm, and it's common to find an overwhelming number of quotes in articles from government officials and a lack of perspectives explaining the root causes of these things. Because, as you say, like, Reuters, for example, they don't have the time for this. But this kind of coverage, as we've all been touching on, it serves to highlight the protesters' violence, weaken support for the strike or whatever is going on, and delegitimize grassroots perspectives. Because even when an ordinary person gets to voice their opinion, in a lot of occasions, they're not going to openly criticize the government. One, maybe because they won't be, their quote won't be used, or two, they might get in real trouble for it. I mean, we're still in Colombia here. That's a reality to these things. So this is what I find fascinating in this day and age. Even though the information might be there, obviously it's very, whoever you interview is entirely subjective.
Yeah, what was interesting in Colombia, and I find this interesting in the United States too, is that over the past 20 years, what's now called like alternative media have really become more important, like to tackle like social issues. And in Colombia, they came up with a really different approach to the protests. So where corporate media were mainly focused on quotes by politicians and authorities, the alternative media really took to the streets and questioned the protesters about like why they were in the street. And in Colombia, what was also interesting in the decade ahead of the protests was that media were like gradually like losing public approval in approval ratings. So like back in 2010, media had an approval rating of 80%, and this had dropped below 50 in the month before the protests of 2021, and a lot of like no media that came up, particularly like Cuestión Pública, but also like lefty media like Pluralidad Z, Cuarto de Hora. But I also think that like our own media like really got a boost because of our approach to those protests.
My episode on the Colombia Calling 375 with Sergio Guzman of Colombia Risk Analysis is still the most listened to today. It was just an explainer on the protests from 2019. Why is Colombia protesting? To this date, it's still the most referred to, and that's telling.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this democratization of who's a journalist and what that role means in our society is ultimately a good thing. I mean, obviously, we all run small independent media companies, so perhaps we're a bit biased in believing that. But I think that it's an important viewpoint, and we provide context that is often missing from larger sources that might not have the time or the experience or the connections to investigate some of these things. But along with that democratization of media, which I want to qualify again, is ultimately a good thing, there are some problems. You get people that come in that are spreading disinformation for attention. That's how they garner attention. And we've seen some of this happening now with the protests in the United States as well, whether that is media from very right-leaning sources, amplifying false claims, whether they be from politicians or conspiracy theorists, that these protests are somehow linked to Hamas, that these people are terrorists. And we've also seen, to a lesser extent, but it would be unethical to deny, is that there has been some infiltration, not necessarily of these protests on the campuses, but in marches and in the larger scene in the United States, of neo-Nazis that are trying to gain sympathetic listeners from the left. An example of that being somebody like Jackson Hinkle, who actually President Petro RT'd a few months ago, one of his criticisms of the Israeli war.
I'm sorry, can you explain who he is?
Yeah, Jackson Hinkle sprang out of this disinformation network in the US that was initially very right-wing and hyper-nationalist. He has done multiple podcasts and interviews with open neo-Nazis as well as white supremacists. But he has rebranded himself now as what he calls a MAGA communist. I don't know what that means, but but he's gained millions of followers since the Gaza war started. And this
on
is
social media.
Yeah, this is a pretty typical way for like fascist ideas and elements of that nature to infiltrate purportedly leftist spaces, right? And so if someone doesn't know who he is, doesn't know his background, and all they see is a video he made criticizing the Israeli war and the Gaza Strip, taken out of context, that seems perhaps harmless on the surface. But the problem is that when you don't look into who these people are and what they really represent, you end up amplifying these negative elements. And like I mentioned, I mean, Petro here, the president, RT'd Hinkle at one point, and I was just like, oh my God, dude, what are you doing?
Yeah.
But anyway,
Yeah,
that's
Petro's done that before.
What I'm trying to emphasize is that the accusations that there is some anti-Semitism at some of these protests, especially the marches, less so the campus events. I mean, that is an uncomfortable truth that I think that the protest movement needs to address and admit. But I think that there's a big conflation there, sort of like how you mentioned in Colombia in the beginning in 2019, in the beginning of the Paro again later, 2 years later. Those initial marches were incredibly peaceful. There were isolated elements of some violence, and those were massively amplified by the media. But it was very disingenuous to claim they were violent protests. And I think that we see a similar dynamic happening here.
Or that those incidents somehow typified like the nature of the protests.
Which they don't in either case. To frame all the protests happening against funding, the U.S. funding of Israel's war in Gaza, to try to frame that entire movement as anti-Semitic as a whole is an intentional conflation that some people are making right now.
In both traditional media and on social media.
Absolutely, as well as politicians.
Right.
The Colombian protests were entirely organic, right at the beginning as well. I mean, you noted the difference. Yeah.
So if you'll allow me, what we saw what I saw in Colombia is that like independent media really got under fire. So what happened with Colombia Reports on my website is that I got kicked off of Facebook on phishing charges. The police cybercrime unit said that they had kicked off some 700 pages from social media in the first few weeks of the protests of 2021. And I got sued by RCN because I exposed how the television network was distorting the truth. So like for example, they were talking like how food prices had gone up because of the protests, while in fact they had gone down. And I watched a podcast on YouTube the other week called the Electronic Intifada, and they complained about being smeared by the Washington Post. So also there, like, you saw some like some hostility, like between like traditional media and alternative media. But
Yeah.
I don't know if there have been more instances.
In the U.S.
Yeah.
I would say that Colombia is kind of next level a bit when it comes to some of that stuff. The police can get away with a lot more. I mean, for example, like using Pegasus software to spy on foreign journalists during the Paro in 2021, there was multiple instances of meaningless arrests or violence against journalists. There were journalists who claimed, although, I mean, I spoke to some of them in Cali, I'm not sure how much proof there is for this, but they claimed they were intimidated by intelligence or followed and surveilled. Obviously, these things are kind of difficult to investigate, but just they clearly believed that this was happening, right? And if you look into Colombia's past, much worse things have happened to journalists. So, I mean, I personally believe them. But we said we were going to stick to just facts. I don't see you don't see that same kind of persecution in the United States. It's just much harder to get away with. You do see, though, I think you're right, you see big media companies kind of demonizing this democratization, like citizen journalists or people who work for small independent media companies like Unicorn Riot or Dissent Magazine. It's like they're kind of treated like, oh, it's cute, you guys are almost real journalists. Well, I mean, they are real journalists. They're on the scene documenting, talking to people, and publishing their work, albeit videos or articles or whatever. I do think that one similarity between the US and Colombia is that both legacy media companies and the circles that they comprise tend to stigmatize new journalism or independent journalism as if it's not real journalism, as if it's more activism. And there are some activist journalists. I think that that's another discussion for another day. But I think generally speaking, you can't just brush off an entire new phenomenon of very important journalism.
Well, what I noticed as like a like alternative media, like when these protests kicked off, like all my friends were at the protest, and their mothers. So when you're in that environment and you go out to work, like you immediately are like more closer to what's happening in the street than what I imagine, like someone who works at a corporate media outlet.
Yeah, I mean, I spent months at the protests in various cities, Bogota, a lot of time in Cali, sometime in Medellin, principally Bogota and Cali. Those are the two kind of most action-packed cities for a while there. And it was very common for me to be hanging out at a protest, working during the day, talking to people. And usually during the day, the protests were 100% peaceful. Usually around 5 o'clock in the afternoon, SMED shows up. People get mad. That's the riot police here. I'm sorry for people who aren't in Colombia. And the riot police have been terrorizing these people for months, right? There was, I don't remember, I don't have the figure in front of me, but there was 40-something deaths during the protests.
Yeah. 79.
Yeah, I'm just talking about the ones at the hands of police. There were other deaths that were accidents or indirect consequences, but more than 40 deaths at the hands of the police. There were hundreds of people that had suffered permanent injuries, whether that was loss of eyes or some kind of decreased mobility. So you can imagine, I think, like the anger that a lot of these protests had towards these infamous riot places. So they would show up at 5 every day and just start antagonizing the situation. And 9 times out of 10, the protest would then turn violent. Sometimes it was because the protester threw a rock at a heavily armed policeman with a giant shield. And sometimes it was because SMAD just started cracking heads. I mean, I don't think you can put all of the blame on one side there. But what I do think you saw is like a dynamic where you had corporate media guys that would just not film anything all day, not talk to anybody about the protests, not release videos of these beautiful dances or these art performances, or
I remember
they would publish the fight, Like they would publish
yeah.
the riot police fighting, and that was all that they published, right? Like all you heard was vandals, violence, they're attacking the police. And
Yeah.
I think it was just as often the police were attacking the protesters.
Well, what I also noticed at one point is that while human rights organizations were talking about like the 79 people being killed or approaching that, Reuters reported that there were 27 based on statistics by the prosecutor general's office, so like an official authority that at the time was like behaving rather suspiciously. So and they wouldn't report on allegations made by human rights organizations and lawmakers, like opposition lawmakers particularly.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the bias that we addressed at the top of the episode, that when your immediate sources that you're trusting are police or police investigative bodies, you're probably not getting all the information.
I'm jumping in here. This is the example of agenda setting in the media, and I found a study online, and I'll post a link to it later on. But it was an excellent study by an independent outlet that did investigations between 28th of April and 12th of May 2019. So the first Paro. Took Semana magazine and El Tiempo newspaper, so the largest news magazines and newspaper in the country, found out how many articles each of those outlets did on the Paro, published on the Paro, and how many were based again on, let's say, damage against infrastructure and quotes from official sources such as politicians and police, and then how many were resulted, the resulting number were how many were actually on the violence and deaths and causes of the Paro. So between the 28th of April and the 12th of May, Semana magazine published 747 articles on the Paro. 69.2% of those, that's 517 of those articles, were based on opinions by politicians, and there were articles about sort of like disturbances and how people weren't going to get to work, transport issues and so on, blockades. And I've got a quote, I've got a headline from El Tiempo: is blockades and marches. This is the mobility for Bogota today, the 12th of May. That was their headline. Wasn't about the march. It was about the inconvenience for the people. But then if you go to El Tiempo, they published 621 articles. That's in total, and 472 of those, or 76%, were opinion articles, again based on government officials, police, and so on. And then only 230 of those articles of the total, that's 30.8%, actually focused on the human rights issues and, of course, the root causes of the Paro. And so, I mean, it's hang on, I got that wrong. It wasn't 230. That was Semana. In El Tiempo, it was 149. So only 24% was on the violence.
Wow.
So it's quite telling, I realize, but again, I guess they're playing to an audience as well, right? Or what they think their audience is.
Well, and I suppose like so are we, like as alternative media. So but what I think is that there's definitely like a reasons to be reading both. Like there's clearly like relevance in what the authorities say and how they respond to protest, but it looks like if you really want to find out what is eating people, that you'll most likely read that at alternative media.
It was clear as well in this study, and they brought in the examples of El País from Spain and La Nación from Argentina, and you would flip the topics entirely. So 70% plus would always have been focused on the human rights and of the issues behind the Paro Nacional, and then the 30% would be based on politicians and what they had to say. So it was very interesting, the difference between international and national media outlets.
Yeah, I was just going to say that's a stark contrast there.
Yeah.
But I suppose you would see the same in the United States. Like you just mentioned The Guardian, for example. So it will be interesting to see at the end of these protests, like how the reporting of foreign media like the BBC or The Guardian was compared to, let's say, the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times.
I kind of think of the 1% marches or whatever, the anti 1% marches, which were very negatively covered, weren't they? In the
I was at those. Yeah, that's funny.
Yeah, you were at those. You are the man who covers protests, so it's.
I mean, I'm on one of the covers of Mother Jones.
Oh wow!
Pretty funny. Yeah, I mean, well, I mean, we see the same thing happening, right? You see these protests. They're trying to frame them as, you know, extreme left. They're trying to frame them as like young kids that don't know anything. They don't have any experience with the world. It just any way that people who aren't fans of these ideas being expressed, anything they can find to delegitimize protests. That's what people are saying publicly, and some media is running with that. You know, obviously, there's an entire spectrum in the U.S. of which media companies might be biased against or towards perhaps these protests. Although I'd say most are biased against. I mean, we've seen already in recent months another interesting dynamic that I think is really highly related. Is that you've seen a lot of censorship on private campuses in the U.S. So maybe for our readers who aren't, our listeners who aren't from the U.S., I just want to make a real quick distinction. So the First Amendment in the U.S. Supposedly allows you the freedom of expression, the ability to say whatever you like as long as you're not causing an imminent crisis or damaging someone. That includes lying. So theoretically, on a public campus such as University of Texas, that should be protected under the First Amendment rights. But there's kind of gets a little trickier on a campus like Columbia, because Columbia is private property. So First Amendment laws aren't public speech laws, right? So I'm gonna make I try to explain this with an example. Richard, I come to your house. I'm like, I'm gonna stay in your bedroom. You're like, okay, cool, thanks, Josh. I mean, you're welcome, Josh. I'm like, thanks, Richard. And then I hang up a big Nazi flag in your window. And you're like, you have to take the Nazi flag down. And I'm like, what? This is my First Amendment rights. But you're like, this is my house, dude. Like, you cannot have a Nazi flag in my house. So theoretically, under US law, that's kind of how the First Amendment works. So Columbia has the right to say, we don't want to have these protests. Now, they'll endure consequences from that, whether that's from donors or board members or bad press coverage or whatever. But nobody's disputing the rights of them to say that they can't hold protests there. But it gets much trickier in a place like UT in Austin. Like, that should be a public square. So Abbott sending the National Guard to remove protesters, I mean, that's pretty clearly unconstitutional. But that's where a lot of this delegitimization tactics come in. If the public views those people as hostile, then there's less likely to be repercussions for Abbott having done something like that. Do you understand what I'm saying?
And it also limits like the spaces where student protesters can express their opposition to government policy.
Oh, of course, yeah. I mean, that's another huge problem in the U.S.
How soon before they start cracking heads there in the U.S., Joshua?
You know, I think that this has gotten kind of an international pushback. Abbott probably doesn't regret what he does because he's trying to make this as partisan as possible. He wants to present himself as like the tough guy who's cracking down on the crazy blue-haired leftists. That's his election campaign. That's neither here nor there in the dynamics of what's really happening. But he's probably pretty pleased with how this has turned out for him. But people in states that maybe aren't as politically charged have seen some very serious international criticism, and I think that does affect the kind of decisions that people are making. I mean, I was reading the piece earlier today. It was an editorial, an opinion piece in The Guardian, but it was basically calling the U.S. a hypocrite for criticizing human rights in other nations while allowing this to happen in their own country. To be frank, this is really nothing new. I think it's kind of shocking for a lot of young people who might not have seen this kind of violence in the U.S. by police against protests before, or not directly participated in. To me, as kind of an old head, I'm like, it takes me back to when I was 20.
I'm looking at the camera and looking at the three hacks, three old grizzled hacks. Anyhow, but I mean, I want to bring it back to Colombia as well, because when I think of agenda setting and I think of the political consequences of just printing what a politician or official spokesman says. I mean, with all respect, of course, you know, you need to put something out there. Of course you do. You put it out there. But when you just print something that was put out in 2019, the Centro Democrático, the Democratic Center's statement on why 21N 21 de Noviembre started, and it says, you know, the Paro was created on the 21st of November to make up part of the Foro de Sao Paulo strategy, of which was trying to destabilize democracy in America, Latin America, seconded by opposition governments whose purpose has been to blockade and like prevent the government of Ivan Duque. And that was printed verbatim on the front page of El Tiempo. And you're like, that should be, if it's anywhere, put that way down. You know, way down there.
I mean, that belongs on an editorial page. That doesn't belong on the front page of the newspaper. Yeah, I mean, I don't remember that headline. That's a very egregious example, but I remember that dialogue. Yeah. And it was very strange to me. Is like I was spending considerable amounts of time at some of these encampments or in protest movements or in marches, and like the idea that these people were like funded by some foreign evil government was just so hilarious to me. But it was something that was really accepted by a lot of the population here, you know. And it seems like we're seeing that same strategy, at least the intention, being applied in the U.S. as well.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, but I do guess that, I mean, there's something to say, like to maintain like a diversity. Like it's perfectly fine if the New York Times wants to focus on like the official line, and that there are other media that have the possibility to give more of an opposition view on things, or like more of a grassroots perspective on policy.
I think we've covered a lot of ground in 35 minutes. It's a hot topic. I think this has worked really well with the three of us finding some time to chew the fat and you know, mull over some issues that are really going on, and to make a comparison between Colombia, where we are, all three of us are located, and of course the United States right now, very topical, is of course fascinating. You know,
I agree.
And we're bringing in our own experiences. So, you know, as you said, you were on the front of Mother Jones at the 1% strikes, but most recently you've been in all the other paros, and of course Adriaan is at the fore of everything that's taking place in Medellin. And I just work from home, but I'm here as well.
You do an amazing job. When I first moved to Colombia, I quickly became a huge fan of your podcast. Years before we met.
No longer.
Oh, so of course this.
Anyhow, but thank you. I think we're going to bring this one to a close. Hopefully, we can do it again about another topic sometime in the future and start pulling us. And by the way, everybody out there listening, this is obviously going out simultaneously on Colombia Reports. Director here is Adriaan Alsema. Pirate Wire Services, who of course created and directed by Joshua Collins, myself with Colombia Calling podcast. We will, all three of us, be bringing these out in different formats across our platforms. So hopefully we'll get a huge draw, because it's going to actually a great conversation backed up with hard facts.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Really, it's fascinating.
We'll talk soon.
Okay, so everybody, we're signing off. Do check out ColumbiaReports.com. Joshua, remind me,
PirateWireServices.com.
That's easy enough, and ColumbiaCalling.co. So there you go, everybody. We're all on the relevant social media evils as well. You can find us there. Thank you, everyone, for listening. I'm sure the three of us will be back with further things to chat about in the future. So, goodbye.